Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Well, as 2022 dawns with Omicron lockdowns and further disruptions, one thing you can rely on is the Boom and Bust panel to enlighten us. Rejoining us are former Canadian Finance and Natural Resources Minister Joe Oliver, former Alberta Cabinet Minister and now head of the Canada West Foundation, Gary Marr, and former Ontario Trade and Economic Development Minister, Sandra Pupatello. Welcome back to all of you and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to all of you.
Yeah. Well, as you noted from my intro, we've obviously got more disruptions related to COVID and the Omicron variant. Sandra, maybe start with you. How do you think this will play out for small businesses and for inflation and those kinds of things?
Well, I will say that today our local chamber president was saying it's hard to keep being hopeful because these waves just keep coming. But I have to say this latest one, I feel like it's coming in like a lion and then it's going to whimpering out very quickly. All the indications with this latest variant being that it's much milder, the impact is less. It's just that it's everywhere. I don't know if you have that same feeling that I have. Everyone I know on both sides of the family has had a near miss or they've contracted this latest variant. So I feel like it's everywhere and I still feel pretty calm about it. So I think that's a function of even the economy is showing that we're going to keep going, that this thing is not shutting us down like it did in March of 2020. But there's no question that we need to worry about our small businesses. They've been getting along thinking, well, the end is near and then it extends again. So I really do worry about our small businesses. It just seems like the larger companies have managed to continue and accommodate, and small businesses do not have the elasticity to do that.
Gary Marr, what's the view out in Alberta with Omicron? It's obviously hitting hard there, a lot of high case numbers as well. What's your feeling on it?
Well, the high numbers are clear, but it's also clear that the majority of people that find themselves in ICUs are the non-vaccinated. But like Sandra said, there's been lots of people that have contracted it. I think Canada has just crossed over about the 2.5 million mark. The good news in all of that is that means about 35 million people have not gotten it. That doesn't mean it isn't important. But it's just as Sandra talked about the importance of trying to stay open for the purposes of business. I would make the same argument about our schools. I'm concerned about kids that are not able to learn online particularly well. That's particularly true of those in the elementary school age, because in order to be able to use online learning, you've got to be able to read. And if you look at the sort of results of where we're at, kids are not up to the standards that we expect them to be able to read and write and have proficiency in maths. And so I think it represents an opportunity for the federal government, which is putting money into childcare, that somehow that also be tied into some form of tutoring or educational opportunity for those children that are of a younger age that need to get a little bit of remedial help to make sure that they're reading at age-appropriate and grade-appropriate levels.
Joe, do you see that the same way, that there's some long-term issues that we're going to have to face?
Absolutely, and I think the press will get on that. That's going to be right now they're obsessed with COVID and the infection rates, where they should really be looking at the hospitalization and death rates, which are decoupled, it seems, from the infection rates. But I'd like to move the point that Gary mentioned a little further. You know, the new Democratic mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, made the point when he said they will not be closing the schools, and most American states have not closed the schools. He said the safest place for kids is in the classroom. And we've taken a very different approach in Canada, and it's going to affect, and it is affecting, and I hear that from physicians, it's affecting the mental health of kids. They feel there's an epidemic of mental health challenges amongst kids. And that's very sad and frankly, very frightening. And the socialization is being impacted. And then, of course, their learning of the basic subjects that they're going to need to succeed.
Joe, we're going to just take a brief break. I apologize. I'll come right back to you, but we will take this break and we'll be back with our guests. Please stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. We're here with our regular panel, which includes Sandra Pupatello, the Honourable Joe Oliver, and Gary Mar. Joe, I had to cut you off there, but please continue making your point about the impacts of COVID.
Well, I'm very concerned, as I said, about kids' education, and unfortunately, it's going to disproportionately impact least advantage kids from least advantaged environments, because they're the ones who are crowded in homes. They're the ones who often need a little bit of extra assistance to compensate for the fact that they have some other disadvantages, and they're the ones being disproportionately hurt, and that's a long-term problem. The other issue is, as you were discussing earlier, the impact on small businesses. There are bankruptcies. And they're going to accelerate the longer this. Many of these small businesses, who are, after all, the major employers in Canada by far, these small businesses are hanging on by the skin of their teeth, and some of them are not going to make it, and it's quite tragic for them, and it reduces competition and, of course, employment. So I'm concerned about productivity and the impact on growth. We've taken an approach which is very much focused on one aspect of the problem, which is the infection of COVID, but it's having a broader impact, as we know, not only on mental health for kids and for adults, but also on physical health. People aren't going in for emergency visits when they need to. They're not getting getting diagnostic treatment. They're not, in some cases, not getting cancer treatment. I mean, this has longer term impacts, and we should take a more holistic approach to that. In my opinion, and don't forget, we're looking at economic growth, according to the OECD, which is going to be very modest. They're predicting the worst growth among developed countries, actually, in Canada, 0.7% between 2020 and 2030, and 0.8% between 2030 and 2060. That's really less than mediocre. And then we've got COVID making that even worse. So,
did anybody want to jump in on what Joe was saying there, Sandra?
Well, I just have to say that I appreciate that the last 2 years have been a particular struggle as governments the world over. We're trying to figure out, what do we do to cope with this pandemic? And the first 6 months, I think we were granting a lot of room for error because we really didn't know what we were doing. Now, I think it's becoming clear that when provincial governments are making decisions, it's certainly not consistent across the country. The education decisions are all being made provincially. So what happens in Alberta doesn't necessarily happen in Ontario or Newfoundland. And likewise, the lockdown decisions are all different. But media is so across the board that it causes just confusion. So you don't know what you're listening to. Did you just hear a rule that's only applicable in Alberta, or is that us here in Ontario? And it really is a good lesson that when we get past this and we do this review of what should we do next time, we've got to have better consistency across the board in this country. So there isn't a confusion about what rule applies because I live here. Is it regional? In Ontario, we went through regional lockdowns instead of all over Ontario, which made sense. That was very different from what happened elsewhere. But the media we were getting was stories from all over the country and the US. We don't even know what we're supposed to be listening to. So I do wish that there was more consistency, more national rules. Maybe that means that the public health folks have to get together and make a standard decision for Canada, not intermittent depending on where you live. That'll take a lot of the politics out of it as well. And maybe those are some of the lessons we need to take from this.
Tony, I mean, you were Minister of Health when SARS took place, and the rules that you put engaged in the province of Ontario were very different from other parts of the country. And I think it actually makes sense to recognize that what rules you're going to place in a place like Saskatchewan are going to be very different than what you're going to have in metropolitan Vancouver or Toronto. So I'm not sure that it makes sense to have national rules. Maybe you would have national data that you could make sort of local rules on based on data that is shared across the country. But I'm not sure that you want to have exactly the same rules for every part of the country, because that is where you're going to have a lot of people pushing back saying, well, that doesn't make any sense for me. And that's when you start to have people who will ignore the rules that you convey that they have to follow.
We've got a number of other topics.
Based on population,
we're going to take a little bit of a break. I'm sorry, guys. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm here with my regular panel, which involves Sandra Pupatello and the Honourable Joe Oliver and Gary Marr, of course. Always lots of discussion. Joe Oliver, you were just about to make a point about the healthcare system. Please make that point.
Yeah, well, to put it less than charitably, the healthcare system is broken. We heard at the beginning we need 2 weeks to flatten the curve, because otherwise the healthcare system is going to be overwhelmed. And we have far fewer beds, ICU beds per capita than they do in the United States, for example. So even though their numbers were higher, they're better able in a lot of states to cope with it. Well, why is it now, 2 years later, we're still hearing the identical thing, even though there are fewer people in ICU in Canada than there were in the previous waves? It seems as if we didn't increase the number of ICU beds, which isn't only the physical beds, of course. It's nurses and doctors to tend to the patients. But that's been a failure. It's not only been a health failure, but it has economic and educational implications, because decisions are being based on the fact that we don't have adequate healthcare capacity, and that's part of the reason that the governments are closing down the economy.
Well, Tony, you would know better as a former Minister of Health. You can't just dream up an ICU nurse to take care of an additional bed overnight or even in a year, because that takes a lot of training and a lot of time. So the challenge is you have to manage what comes into that ICU, because you can't manage having enough staff with the right skill set to manage that bed. Otherwise, they would instantly create more ICU beds. It's why they sent adult patients into Toronto's sick kids at the height of the second or third wave.
But it's been 2 years.
I think they've managed to do the best they can under the circumstance. But the reality is that governments in every Western country is moving to 80% healthcare in the community and 20% in acute care settings. The world over, they've been doing that for years. All of a sudden, we have a pandemic where, sheesh, I wish it was reversed, and you can't just instantly make that happen.
No, you can't.
No,
but let me just say this. Let me just say
years.
this, since Sandra's invited me to be on my show. But because I agree, you can't just whip up new doctors and nurses and beds out of thin air. But think about the economic cost that we're going through, which is in the tens of billions of dollars. I could easily think that with good imagination, if we spent $5 billion on ICU capacity in a year, I bet you we could come up with new ICU beds if we had, and $5 billion is a drop in the bucket of the economic cost of lockdown. So the one thing I would say is government and public health have to have better imaginations, because right now we're in the situation where it's lockdown whack-a-mole. And that's not, we can't keep doing this. We're just doing the same thing over and over again. People are not going to comply after a while. So
yeah, I would agree. You want to be able to increase and decrease. We have to accept that we're going to spend money that we might not necessarily need at any given time to be prepared to go to 120% instead of 100. 100%. And that's where, unfortunately, the governments don't want to be that risky to have to admit, well, we spend 20% of our budget pretending we might need it, only to be shot in the foot when they realize that they should have. But Tony, in the end, no one predicted we would have 2 years of a pandemic either. So the spend in the early days, it was get us through this hump. And all of a sudden, it's a 2-hump camel here.
Yeah, but Joe Oliver made that point. Now we've been through it. It'll be very interesting to see what the lessons from COVID are going to be And I think a lot of it is going to be a flex and surge capacity in the future, which it was after SARS too, when I was health minister in 2003. But unfortunately, those lessons were lost over time. And here we are. Yeah. We've got about a minute left. Gary Marr, I want to say this. Jack Mintz was on my program this week as well. He was saying Alberta's got its mojo back. Has Alberta got its mojo back?
There is some evidence of that. The economic growth projected for 2022 is 6.1%. We've had announcements of billions of dollars of investment ranging from a green ethylene cracker from Dow Chemicals and probably other petrochemical projects coming on stream. We've had jobs created with announcements from Amazon setting up a center here with Infosys and Emphasis creating quantum computing jobs. You've got the recent decision, the final decision on Canadian Pacific acquiring Kansas City Railways for $31 billion.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, with our monthly panel. Sandra Pupatello, you and I know a lot about supply chains with our work with Reshoring Canada. What do you see as the supply chain picture for 2022?
I think it's going to be like a redo of 2020 and 2021 based on the companies that you and I are dealing with Reshoring Canada, for more than just pandemic reasons. And I think we've realized that well before the pandemic, a number of issues were impacting the supply chain, but it really took the pandemic to make all of it happen all at the same time on every continent across multiple industries. And that's really what happened. Now the solutions, I think, are a little more complex, but it hasn't gone away. Natural disasters, forest fires, snowing where they don't have a snow shovel. All of these things are still continuing to happen even today. So I do think that this notion of reshoring or reshoring to somewhere more friendly, I think that's going to stick. And the fact that you and I have gotten such a great response from the work we're doing with that organization, I think businesses have long waited for everybody to get on side and be helpful to make better business for our Canadian companies.
Gary Marr, speaking of trade, obviously Canada-U.S. trade is always the big elephant in the room. And you're a former Alberta agent in Washington, D.C. You know what the workings of Capitol Hill. What do you see as 2022 when you think about Canada-U.S. trade?
Well, I don't think the relationship that Ottawa has with Washington is a particularly good one at this point. Some of which the responsibility can be laid at the feet of the federal government, but some of which are some of the real problems that exist in the United States today. I think that democracy has always been a messy affair in the United States, and it's messy again. We've seen, in the past, stories like Father Coughlin or Huey Long or George McGovern and sort of toying with fascism in the United States. And I don't think it's too alarmist to talk about that word today. And a lot of commentators in the last couple of weeks in the Globe and Mail and other, the National Post have talked about the real issues and what Canada should be doing to prepare for the possibility of the Biden administration losing both the House and Senate in midterm elections, and the possibility of Donald Trump coming back in 2024, and the messiness of democracy and the continued ongoing experiment in the United States. So while people comment on the challenges that we have in Canada's relationship with China, I don't think we should be naive as Canadians to think that all will be well in the United States either, and that we should be, out of self-interest, not so naive about what might happen in the U.S. and how we should prepare for it.
Joe Oliver, we've got about a minute left there. I'd love to get your thoughts on some of this as well.
Okay. I don't share the growing paranoia that people in Canada have about a fascist takeover of the United States. I think that's That's frankly way over the top. There may well be, and it looks like there will be, a Republican takeover of Congress, which is not the same thing. In the here and now, our problem, frankly, is Democratic Party protectionism. I mean, we had the Keystone XL turned down, and now we've got the President of the United States introducing a $12,500 tax credit for electric vehicles. That's a serious problem. The second one is a serious problem for Ontario and the automotive industry. This is a body blow to a huge industry in Ontario, which the Liberal Party seems to be concerned about much more than
Which, in fairness, Joe, it just got its own body blow by one of its own members. So the thing's been knocked to the back burner by Manchin. I don't think he stopped that bill because of the EV tax credit, but that was sort of like a benefit for us. So it is stalled at this point.
To be continued. As always, the panel has lots of ideas, lots of suggestions, and even a few disagreements. That's the great thing about this great panel we have on Boom and Bust. Thank you for watching. A lot we didn't talk about. We didn't talk too much about Canada, China, for instance, or how we're going to weather the storm and the impact of inflation. So topics for next time, but thanks for watching today. It's great to have you along for the ride.